Imagine that you are receiving a life sentence, locked up in a huge fortified prison, surrounded by a thick wall that is impossible to break through. Will you accept your fate and remain where you are? Or will you act out like the prisoners we are going to see their story today? These prisoners were dangerous criminals who had been given life sentences, and for this reason, they were housed in a heavily guarded prison. Despite their failures several times and despite all the obstacles they faced, they kept trying to put together the weirdest plans and smartest ideas to escape from this prison. So, let's discover their thrilling story. The events of today's story took place in a prison called Clinton Correctional Facility, also called Dannemora Prison, referring to where it is located. Dannemora is a mountainous area in the north of New York. This Dannemora prison is a maximum security prison, one of the most heavily guarded and fortified prisons, meaning that its security is at its highest possible level according to American prison standards. And such prisons only house the most hardened murderers and criminals. Dannemora Prison is located in the middle of a small town where about 5,000 people live, which is something unusual. Most prisons like this are located in isolated areas or on the outskirts of cities, so it's strange that a prison like this is located in the middle of a town surrounded by residents. Anyway, this Dannemora prison is surrounded by a 9-meter-long wall. It's so tall that no one can climb it. It is almost impossible, but the hardest part is that the thickness of this wall is up to 2 meters, and the wall is built with concrete reinforced by iron bars. So no matter what was done, it's impossible to be dug or penetrated. Besides, watchtowers spread out along the wall where armed guards are monitoring the prison 24 hours a day. And as I told you before, this area is a mountainous area. What makes this prison more secure is that its walls are built on mountain rocks, so it's impossible to dig an underground tunnel, no matter what kind of tools you have. Literally, this prison has no exit but its doors. Dannemora Prison is a facility from which escape is supposed to be impossible. So who are these prisoners who will try to break out of the impossible? The first prisoner is called Richard Matt. Richard is a murderer who was sentenced to life imprisonment, and he was dubbed the Saw because he once used a saw to cut off his victim's body. In 1997, Richard kidnapped his boss, put him in the car's trunk, and then kept driving for 24 hours. And from time to time, he stopped, opened the trunk, hit him, and tortured him in an attempt to get his money. He used to force him to admit where he keeps his money, but that poor man kept telling him that he didn't hide anything and didn't have money, and the problem was that man was an old man in his 70s. Richard kept driving around, and the old man was in the trunk of the car until he died. After the old man had died, Richard took him to an isolated hut in the middle of the forest, cut off his body with a saw, and threw him in the Niagara River. After this crime, he went to Mexico, where he committed another crime as well. He murdered another person, but the Mexican authorities were able to arrest him, and he remained imprisoned in Mexico for 9 years. He was then extradited to America, and eventually he was put in the Dannemora prison. Until now, 7 years have passed, and he is still in this prison. Every year, he becomes more and more determined to escape. Even his family, and his daughter in particular, says that whenever they'd visited him in prison, he only talked about escape. He wanted to escape by any means possible. One of the things that Richard Matt excelled at was his ability to manipulate and persuade. He was good at manipulating people, and he was sure that he would find a way to manipulate the right people to escape. Throughout his time in prison, escape was his only concern, and he knew that in order to escape, he would need a trusted partner to help him. But who could this person be? The partner was actually the prisoner in the next cell that was attached to his cell, the criminal named David Sweat. And if Richard Matt was the mastermind of the breakout operation, we can consider David Sweat to be the engineer. David Sweat, from his younger years, was going in and out of prison, and his entire past was a purely criminal past since his teenage years. But the biggest crime he committed was the murder of a police chief. After this crime, David was imprisoned in the Dannemora prison with a life sentence, and he has been in this prison for 12 years until now. During these years, David gained valuable skills through his work in various prison workshops, and he was helping with the electricity work at the prison. Because the prison always used prisoners for repair and renovation work, they would create workshops for them, develop their skills, and train them in aspects such as carpentry, blacksmithing, electricity, and so on. That's why we called David the engineer, because he had many excellent skills in these aspects that would help them in the escape. Anyway, since Richard met and David's sweat cells were next to each other, they got to know each other and became friends. And since Richard always thinks about escaping, he told David about his intention, and they started thinking about a plan that could get them out of this place. After a while, they came up with the next plan. They would open the doors of their cells, leave the building to the outer yard of the western side, and they would reach the wall and climb out from that point because it's the furthest point from the watchtowers. But this plan had many problems. First, how would they open their cells? Second, how would they climb the wall? Ultimately, they decided to deal with the problem step by step. First, they needed a way to open the cells, whose locks were supported by screws that required a special screwdriver called Torx. But of course, they didn't have any tools, and this screwdriver was not available in any prison workshop. The only solution was to find someone out of prison who could get them the screwdriver they needed. Richard knew right away who he was going to target. He was going to target the head of the sewing workshop, who was a lady called Joyce Mitchell. Richard and David both used to go to the sewing workshop in prison. Joyce Mitchell was in her late 40s, and she was in a bad relationship with her husband. She was in an unhappy marriage. So Richard started to get close to her and talk to her. As we mentioned before, Richard was good at manipulating people. So Richard started to get close to Joyce and convince her that he loved her, and they started to get into a relationship. Little by little, Richard started to ask her for some simple things that were not allowed to be given to him, but at the same time, things that were not dangerous. The first thing he asked for was a pair of glasses with LED lights that helped with reading at night, because the light turns off in the cells after 10 o'clock. So Joyce brought him the glasses, and Richard kept asking for simple things from time to time, things that were not appealing to suspicions. We can say that it was like he was pulling her little by little towards something bigger. No matter how strong their relationship was, and no matter how much Joyce fulfilled his requests, it would be difficult for him to ask her for a screwdriver without the risk of her turning on him. So Richard needed something that would assure him that she would never turn on him. Imagine that he asked her for obscene pictures of her. Of course, you would say that it is impossible to accept something like this. She would not be that stupid. But once again, let me remind you that Richard was malicious. He knew how to manipulate people and persuade them. Eventually, he managed to convince Joyce that he loved her, and in the end, he was able to convince her to give him the pictures. Now, after he had the pictures, Richard knew that Joyce had become a toy in his hands, and he could manipulate her as he pleased and ask her for anything. Even if she didn't obey him out of love, she would definitely obey him out of fear of scandal. And indeed, Richard asked her to bring him the Torx bit he needed, with which he would be able to unscrew the lock screws on the cell door. Joyce brought the screwdriver bit and gave it to him in the workshop. But now, Richard's next task is to smuggle it from the workshop to the cell, because when the prisoners leave the workshop, they are thoroughly searched with metal detectors. So how can Richard avoid the search without being discovered? Imagine that Richard had a headphone. It was allowed for the prisoners to use such things in their lives inside the prison. The headphone had metal inside, and the metal detector would make a sound when it passed through it. So Richard put the screwdriver bit inside an empty place in the headphone. Richard was able to go through the search and get out of the workshop without any problems. And when he arrived at the cell, he handed the screwdriver bit over to his neighbor, David Sweat. David started trying to use the Torx bit to unscrew the lock screws. For several days, each one kept trying to unscrew the lock of his cell, but it was not working. Here, the two partners realized that their plan would not work. The first attempt failed, but this did not mean that Richard and David would surrender or give up the idea of the escape. On the contrary, they became more persistent and immediately started thinking of an alternative plan. This time, David started thinking, saying that if we can't get out of the doors, we must get another exit. And the first thing that came to his mind was the vent. Every prison cell has a vent in the back wall, and David knew that if he could open this vent, he would enter the place known as the catwalks, which is a term used to refer to the back area behind the prison cells, which looks like a tunnel where the power lines and ventilation pipes are extended, and all the extensions that the prison cells need. David had actually entered the catwalk several times before. He was allowed to enter to do some electrical repairs on some of the cells because, as we said, the prison uses prisoners for repairs, manual work, renovation, and things like that. David entered the catwalk several times, so he knew the place and the kind of back extensions. For David to enter that space, he needs a tool to cut the cover of the vent opening so that he can remove it to go through. Here it was Richard's turn to get the right tools. Of course, they needed a sharp tool to cut out the vent cover. Richard immediately thought about Joyce. He asked her to bring him hacksaw blades. These blades were bigger than the screwdriver bit, so he couldn't place them inside the headphones as he did the first time. Here came the turn of Richard's second ally. Joyce wasn't the only person Richard manipulated. During the years that Richard spent in Dannemora prison, he got to know a guard named Gene Balmer. Gene was the guard supervisor in the prison ward where Richard was. Richard and Gene had an unofficial agreement that Richard would maintain calm and stability in that prison ward. Due to his strong personality, Richard was like a leader and had control over the prisoners. And in return, the guard, Gene, will allow him to get some special privileges. Of course, these privileges did not include the ability to smuggle dangerous items or tools that could help him escape. Richard didn't tell the guard Gene that he wanted to smuggle hacksaw blades, but he took advantage of his friendship with Gene to leave the sewing workshop without being searched. When Richard entered the sewing workshop, he took the hacksaw blades from Joyce, went to the bathroom, and stuck them on his chest. He left the bathroom and pretended to be suffering from a stomachache. In such a situation, the procedure is that a guard comes and accompanies the prisoner to his cell after searching for him. But in this case, the accompanying guard was Gene. Gene accompanied Richard and let him get out of the workshop and return to his cell without being searched with a metal detector. Because they were friends, as we mentioned before. However, Gene didn't know that Richard was smuggling hacksaw blades. Afterward, Richard handed over some of the blades to David, and each of them began to cut out the cover of the back vent opening of his cell. Of course, they were keen to cut at noisy times when there was more disturbance, especially at night, when some prisoners are watching television in the movie room, while other prisoners are playing card games and others are still working in the kitchen. The disturbance should be as loud as possible so that no one can hear the sound of the cutting. After 3 weeks of cutting, David managed to cut the opening cover of his cell back vent completely, while Richard was still working on it. Before David goes down to the back space or the catwalks, he has to do a little trick as camouflage. So that no one would discover his absence, he takes clothes and puts them under the quilt and shapes them in a way that gives the appearance of someone sleeping on the bed and covers it with a blanket completely, which was allowed and normal in New York prisons. There was no law that forbids prisoners to cover their entire body while sleeping. And of course, at the same time, Richard will keep an eye on the place, and his mission is to distract any guard who may approach David's cell and suspect that something is happening. So, every night before bedtime, the guards do the final check for the prisoners, and every prisoner must be in his cell. After that, they turn off the lights, and every prisoner sleeps. After the final check is done and the lights are turned off, David immediately gets out of the cell through the opening of the back vent. From the first night, David went down to the catwalks. He was able to crawl until he reached the ladder that leads to the underground tunnels, which are a large tunnel network located under the prison through which huge pipes are extended, such as steam pipes that are used for heating during the winter, as well as water heaters and other things that need to be extended in large spaces. This tunnel network was a huge space, to the point that David didn't know exactly where to go. He was even surprised that there were no doors or partitions separating these tunnels. All of them were open to each other and were extended under the entire area of the prison. David began to go down every night from his cell and discover these underground tunnels, looking for a way out. But after several nights of exploration, David realized why there were no doors or partitions to separate these tunnel networks. It is true that the tunnels are open to each other, but there is no way to get out of them. All of them are a huge closed network to each other without a way out. After a week, Richard finally managed to remove the cover of the vent opening of his cell. But the two partners agreed that David would continue to discover the underground tunnels because of his agility and lightness, unlike Richard, who was fat. But the problem now is that David has been going down to these tunnels every night for a week without a result, so they needed a new plan. After a while of thinking, they got an idea. Next to the prison, there was a power generation station that was about 200 meters away from the prison wall. This station extended the prison with energy and steam. So if David could find the pipes that lead to the power station, he could find a way out. David kept exploring these pipes for several additional nights until he finally reached his goal. David found two large steam pipes, labeled in and out. The pipe labeled in is the one that leads the steam from the power station to the prison, and the pipe labeled out is the one that gets the steam from the prison to the power station. David kept following these pipes for a long distance under the prison, hoping that in the end, it would lead to the power station. He hoped that this way would pass under the huge walls of the prison. David kept following the pipes until he reached the end, but the end was not as he hoped for. David reached a wall through which the pipes passed. The happy thing is that this was not the thick wall of the prison. David concluded that when they built the prison, they did not care about fortifying the walls of the underground tunnels. It was a normal wall, which is much easier to break through than the 2-meter thick wall. Although David did not have any suitable digging tools except for the hacksaw blades, he started working immediately and began digging in the wall with blades that were not designed for digging at all. He knew that it would take time, but at least it was possible. So David kept digging every night. He was digging in the cement that sticks the stones together. The process was very slow, but he was making progress. The situation remained the same for about a month until one night, David found a treasure. When David came out of his cell that night, while walking in the tunnel, he saw a big red box. He opened it, and he was surprised by all the kinds of tools he hoped for. In fact, this box was the toolbox of workers who worked in the maintenance works inside the prison tunnels. This box was not supposed to be there, but these workers were not prisoners, and when they entered the prison, they had to be searched. So as to reduce the time of the search while entering the prison from the main gate, the deputy chief of the prison allowed them to keep their tools in the tunnel away from the prisoners. They had never expected that there would be prisoners who could reach this place without permission. The most important tool that David got in the box was a hammer. The hammer would help him break through the wall much faster than he expected. David kept digging for 2 weeks until he finally opened a wide opening in the wall that he could go through. He was so happy that he could get out of the hole he had dug, but this happiness was destroyed when David realized that this was not the last wall. He saw another wall through which the pipes passed, and when he approached the wall, he realized that this was not an ordinary wall. It was an extension of the huge outer wall that was 2 meters thick. David was standing in front of the wall in a state of shock. After all this work and effort, is this the result in the end? It is impossible to accept this. David returned to the cell and told Richard about the wall. The two partners decided to keep digging in this wall until they reached the other side, no matter how long the process took. Even if it took 10 or 20 years, it does not matter. They will continue. They even laughed when they remembered that the hero of the famous movie, The Shawshank Redemption, took 20 years to dig a tunnel to escape from prison. The two partners took turns every night digging in the huge wall. Each time one of them went down and dug. It was very difficult. The slow progress demoralized them, especially with the amount of effort expended. Imagine going down every night to dig with all your effort for hours and hours and only seeing the simple, trivial result. However, Richard and David continued to dig every day until one night, when David opened the red toolbox and found a digging drill. He was happy. Finally, they have a tool that can really help them dig the huge wall. Even with the use of the drill, it would take a long time, but at least now it has become more realistic and possible. But the problem is that the drill did not have a drill bit. David went back to his cell and told Richard about it. Richard was happy with the news and immediately began to think about how he could find a drill bit. Of course, the first person Richard thought about was Joyce. Joyce would definitely get the drill bit because she is now considered a partner in the operation. She even agreed with them that when they escaped from the prison, she would be waiting for them outside in her car to escape, and in the end, the three of them would go to Mexico and live there. Richard was sure that Joyce would get the drill bit, but he did not know how he could smuggle it to the cell. After a while of thinking, he got the right idea. The prisoners could buy food from the prison cafeteria, but everything in this cafeteria was cooked. It was not allowed for the prisoners to take something uncooked with them. Although this was against the rules, it was common for guards to allow the smuggling of raw meat for prisoners who have a good relationship with them. And of course, Richard had an excellent friendship with the guard, Gene Balmer, whom we mentioned before. Richard told Joyce to bring drill bits, put them inside raw meat, and then freeze the meat and give it to the guard, Gene, to deliver it to him. Indeed, this is what happened. Joyce followed Richard's instructions, put the drill bits inside the meat, and handed over the meat to the guard, Gene, who took it from her and delivered it to Richard. Of course, Gene did not know that this meat had drill bits inside. He knew that what he did was against the rules and that smuggling such things to the prisoners was forbidden, but he did not know that he was helping Richard escape. That night, David went down to the tunnels with the drill bits. He was excited that the real digging operation would finally begin. But his excitement evaporated in a moment when he found out that the red toolbox was not in place. The box disappeared. David was disappointed. He felt like the world was against him. Once again, he went back to the starting point. The only thing that was left for him was the hammer because it was not inside the toolbox but was next to it. The situation was very tense, but Richard and David decided to continue. They had to get out of this place no matter how. They continued the same way, hitting the wall and digging and using the hammer. This lasted for several days, specifically until May 4, 2015. On this date, a great transformation happened, and an unexpected exit was opened for them. During the past period that they were working on digging this wall, there were hot steam pipes next to them, and they were feeling the heat. But that night, David did not feel any heat coming from the pipes. He realized that the prison had stopped the hot steam that was used to heat up because the winter was over and it was summer. This pipe in front of David was a large pipe with a 60 centimeters diameter, which would be large enough to enter through. It may be a bit tight for his friend Richard, but this pipe is the exit. So immediately, David informed Richard about the situation, and he was very happy. But he knew that, at the same time, he would need to lose weight to be able to get out through this pipe. From that moment on, he began a very severe diet. He almost didn't eat anything except when he was forced to. He was only living with water. At the same time, David started to go down every night to the steam pipe and cut it out with the hacksaw blades he had. The process was slow, but he was trying to make big progress. Little by little, within a week, he was able to cut out an opening in this pipe. David entered the pipe, and it was clear that this pipe went through the outer wall of the prison, the 2-meter thick wall that they were unable to dig. This pipe was really their way out. Finally, they got the exit that they had been looking for all these past months. But there was still one problem. Now they had to open another opening in the pipe after the wall, meaning that he had to enter the pipe, crawl until he crossed the wall, and then cut out another opening from inside the pipe. However, cutting out the pipe from the inside was 1,000 times harder than cutting it from the outside. The pipe from the inside was narrow, and David could barely move, let alone cut the pipe from the inside. Nevertheless, David was determined to finish this job. He kept working on this operation and kept coming down every night and cutting until he finally managed to open a hole from the inside after 3 weeks of work. David got out of the hole and found himself in a new tunnel. He was sure that he had crossed the huge wall of the prison, but he didn't know exactly where he was. He kept walking a bit inside the tunnel, and he immediately realized where he was through the smell that he smelled. David had never in his life been so glad to smell such an unpleasant smell as he was this time when he realized he had reached the town's sewage system. As he walked a bit along the tunnel, he found a ladder that led to the sewer system opening. He went up using the ladder, opened the manhole cover, and found himself in the streets of the town. David was over the moon to the point that he thought about escaping and leaving Richard behind. But after a while, he decided to calm down, close the cover, go back to the tunnel, and then to his cell. When Richard heard the news, he was so happy, and the two partners started preparing themselves for the big escape. The next morning, Richard told Joyce that they were going to escape that night at 11:30 p.m. and told her where the tunnel led so she could wait for them there in her car. That night, on June 6, 2015, Richard and David left their cells after putting their clothes under their bellies. They went through the tunnels until they reached the pipe. David passed through the pipe easily, followed by Richard. But the latter, despite losing a lot of weight in the past month, got stuck and couldn't crawl. He panicked and started yelling at David, who asked him to be quiet. Otherwise, they were going to be exposed. David tried to calm him down and threw him a bedsheet that they had taken from the prison, trying to pull him. After suffering, they finally managed to get to the second opening and get out of the pipe. Fortunately for them, apparently no one had heard Richard screaming. Anyway, David and Richard arrived at the ladder, and David went up to the manhole cover and took a look to make sure that Joyce was there and waiting for them in her car. However, he turned his head in all directions, and there was no trace of Joyce or her car. Then he went down again and told Richard about it. Richard asked him to wait a few more minutes. What they didn't know was that Joyce, in fact, was afraid of this operation and was in a state of panic to the point that she went to the hospital. The two partners waited for her for about a quarter of an hour until midnight. David went out again to see if she had come, but she wasn't there. David and Richard realized that they had to leave this place right away because it was 12 a.m. and there were only 5 hours left for the morning check for the prisoners, so they didn't have time to waste. They had to leave this area as soon as possible. At 5 a.m., it was time for the morning check of the prisoners, and the guards were under an unimaginable shock when they discovered that Richard and David were not in their cells, and then they were even more shocked when they discovered that there were 2 openings in the wall. Immediately, the alarm system was turned on, and the police were reported. This incident was huge. The media began to cover the case from the very first hours, and the governor of New York arrived at the prison and checked the place by himself. He went down to the underground tunnels of the prison and saw the holes that David and Richard had made. Then he held a press conference and announced that he would do his best to arrest them, and anyone involved in this case would be punished. The security response to this escape was unprecedented in New York. The authorities knew that these 2 criminals were among the most dangerous types of fugitives, and they had to be arrested as quickly as possible. The plan was to conduct a large-scale search involving officers from various law enforcement agencies, including police, forest rangers, and the FBI, and all units that could be used in the search were recruited. These forces began a large-scale search operation by land and air, and a large number of security checkpoints were established in various areas surrounding Dannemora. At the same time, Richard and David were hiding in the forest at the farthest point they could reach during the 5 hours before discovering their escape. At some point, they decided to separate from each other because it would definitely be harder to arrest them together if each of them was going in a different direction. This large search operation lasted 21 days until June 26, 2015. On this date, Richard was caught 80 kilometers away from the prison. The police surrounded Richard next to a hunting hut in one of the forests. It was clear that Richard could get a gun from this hut when the police besieged him. He raised the gun at them, and the police shot and fired him dead. The strange thing is that they later discovered that the gun he had was empty, which means that Richard mostly did not want to be caught and go back to prison, and he preferred to die. This was his way of making the officer shoot him. As for David, he was arrested 2 days later. On June 28, 2015, David tried to cross the Canadian-American border and enter Canada, but one of the border guards knew his identity, aimed his gun at him, and ordered him to stop. David refused to surrender and immediately started to run and try to cross the border to Canada, which prompted the guard to gunfire on him. David was shot in the leg and fell down. He was then treated and caught alive. The chase that lasted for 23 days was finally over, the chase in which more than 1,500 security officers participated, the chase that ended with Richard Matt's death, and the arrest of David Sweat. After investigating with David, he admitted all the operation details, what happened, how they carried it out, and who were their accomplices. Right after that, Joyce Mitchell and security guard Gene Ballmar were arrested. For David, a life sentence was added to his previous sentence, and he is still in prison to this day. As for Joyce, she was fined $86,000 and sentenced to 4 years in prison, and the guard, Gene, was fined $5,000 and sentenced to 6 months in prison because he did not know that he was helping them escape. We have reached the end of our story. Do not forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Goodbye.